A Man Called Ove was written in 2012 as the debut novel of Fredrik Backman. This is not my normal type of book. I decided to read this because it was recommended by a YouTuber named Bookjack, who usually reads science fiction as well. And he said it was kind of like someone seeing you struggling with the world and telling you, hey, I understand you. And that made me really intrigued. I wanted that warm feeling that I thought would come with that. I'm not old relative to most people, but I'd say like the last 2 years has been when I first seriously started considering aging, both in myself and in my parents. And it's really scary and intimidating. I guess I kind of went into this book hoping for not the typical science fiction head in your clouds what ifs, but instead the down-to-earth wisdom on some things like aging, love, and death. And that's exactly what I got. This book is wrapped in a really approachable shell. There's a cat on the cover, it's got a cute cover, and it starts off with Ove just arguing with someone in an Apple store about the difference between an iPad and a laptop. But the reality of this book is that it's quite immensely sad. The main character, Ove, has just lost the love of his life, and just before the start of the book was asked to take a step back at work. And this book is basically about Ove considering and attempting to kill himself in like 4 or 5 different ways because of these hardships. Now, as these attempts fail, he starts to develop a friendship and an appreciation with those around him, while also learning how to cope with the fact that time is never going to move backwards and it will never go back to the way that life used to be. So let's talk about the main character, Ove, and I Googled it. Apparently it's supposed to be pronounced Ove. We're definitely supposed to see him as a cute old man, but he's certainly undeniably an asshole at some points. He's got all those cute attributes that a suburban 60-year-old man would have, like he's obsessed with his favorite car brand, but he's also annoyingly traditional and a tad racist and fatphobic and stuff like that in the relatively harmless way that traditional people can be. I found myself a little averse to wanting to connect with him at the beginning of the book because it's just so obvious that that's what Backman wants to desperately get all his readers to do, to love and latch onto him. Regardless, it did not take me that long to feel some kinship towards him, and by the end of the book, I felt like I would go to war for him. I think one thing I liked so much about this book was how much I can see Ove in people in my life. Not necessarily him in his entirety is exactly like one person in my life, but he's got different elements that I can certainly relate to a lot of people in my life. Like his love for cars reminded me of my own dad. His begrudging relationship with a cat reminded me of my uncle, etc. And I think Backman does a great job of setting up Ove as a character broadly enough to be associated with many people in your own life. This book is not extremely complex. Even the characters are all pretty one-dimensional. But I don't mean this in a demeaning way. I mean this as it's simple in the way that life sometimes is. Things like death and aging and love are pretty easy ideas to wrap your head around, and you're introduced to these concepts at a very young age, but it takes a lifetime to grapple with and come to terms with these emotions. I read this book for a different reason than I read a lot of books. I like the theoretical, mind-expanding nature of science fiction, but this one helps readers grasp the simple yet infinitely difficult challenge of life around things like aging, love, death, and the passage of time while the world moves on around you. Ove deals with tragedy, but not the kind of tragedy that you read about in a lot of books, where the world is going to be destroyed by an alien race or someone's entire family is tortured and killed. It's tragedy that everyone experiences. His parents die, his wife dies, he survives auto accidents, he sees people that he loves betray him, he ages, etc. Some of the stuff in this book seemed just overly serendipitous, like things would work out just perfectly, everyone seemed to know each other, People would show up at exactly the right time, etc., etc. And at the beginning of the book, this bothered me. But as it kind of went on, I started thinking, can we just not accept this? Because it makes for a good story. Yeah, it's cliche and it's unrealistic in moments, but I mean, we read science fiction and we accept ridiculous postulates like aliens invading the world and time travel and faster than light travel. So why can't we just do that on a little bit of a smaller scale? This is the type of book that invites you to suspend your belief about things that are overly accidental or childish and stuff like that. It's kind of like you're an adult watching a Disney movie. Maybe it's not the most intellectually stimulating in terms of themes and stuff like that, but it's still beautiful and touching regardless. So I think for a book to be really good that's written in a manner like this, it has to deliver on its commentary about life. And I think A Man Called Ove definitely does. Ove provides a persistent but melancholy outlook and wisdom about life. And it's sometimes pretty hard to read. There are a lot of moments where Ove reflects on some really tough things about life. Through very relatable situations like fights with insurance or ignorant people, Ove contemplates things like sorrow and the evilness of life in general. In a really good way, Backman encapsulates the feeling of hopelessness when it comes to tragedy and the unwavering passage of time. Ove sort of puts his hand on the reader's shoulder and says, look, I get it. Life is somewhat miserable. We're sort of set up to fail. We're set up to get our heart broken. We're set up for sadness. While he keeps his hard outer shell, Ove has slidden into somewhat of a depression. Let me share a quote that he has while thinking about the death of his wife and the loss of his job and the drop-off of his life into something that he considers meaningless. Quote, nothing can bring her back to him. In the end, there is nothing left but a long series of weekdays with nothing more meaningful than oiling the kitchen counters. And Ove can't cope with that anymore. He feels it in that moment more clearly than ever. He can't fight anymore. Doesn't want to fight anymore. Just wants it all to stop. And that's what I mean when I say that this book is wrapped in a very approachable shell, but god damn it, you feel some really intense emotions during this book. And that's, even comparing to things like science fiction that usually operate in a much grander scope. I don't want you to get the wrong impression, though, that this book is a book with generally a negative outlook on life. There are plenty of messages about love and acceptance and positives like that I just haven't quoted here. The hardships are more so just brought up to validate the reader's own adversities. The theme of this book is ultimately about hopefulness and finding meaning wherever you're at in life. Okay, let me talk about the one thing that I just absolutely could not stand in this book, and that is Backman's extremely out of place, gross depiction of obese people. There's a neighbor of Ove named Jimmy who is overweight, and they speak really graphically about how fat he is. They describe him as lazy, he's constantly sweaty, he's gross, and Backman writes specifically about how the fat flaps all over his body and stuff like that. And that's his only defining characteristic. He's fat. He's literally written like a caricature. He's constantly asking for snacks and food, and they make jokes about him failing to go on a diet and etc. When he's introduced, he's going into Ove's house for 5 minutes and he already immediately asks for a sandwich. And then later, he's riding along with Ove and some other people to the hospital, and he just begs the driver to stop at a McDonald's so they can get some food. On their way to the hospital. I hope you all know this, but people don't act like that, even if they're overweight. Obviously, Ove is judgmental, but him being judgmental has nothing to do with Backman writing Jimmy in such an exaggerated way. The only thing that I can think of for the author doing this is he thinks that it's funny that Jimmy is overweight, but yeah, it's not very funny to me. Overall, what an embarrassing stain on an otherwise extremely wholesome book. It's really too bad. Anyway, let's wrap this up. I think that one of the only ways to become more comfortable with these very uncomfortable things like death and aging is to talk about them. And I think that being exposed to them throughout the course of this book was really a moving experience. It doesn't take a genius in a theoretical sense to understand life and death and loss and aging and love and betrayal, but to learn to cope with these things is another beast entirely. This book is like Ove holding your hand as you experience these emotions and saying, I'm here. We all experience these things and you will too. Let's get through them together. Just as life concludes with death, so will my review. I'm going to leave you with a quote of Backman's that I think exemplifies his really good understanding of some of the most difficult parts of life, like death. Death is a strange thing. People live their whole lives as if it does not exist, and yet it's often one of the great motivations for living. Some of us, in time, become so conscious of it that we live harder, more obstinately, with more fury. Some need its constant presence to even be aware of its antithesis. Others become so preoccupied with it that they go into the waiting room long before it has announced its arrival. We fear it, yet most of us fear more than anything that it may take someone other than ourselves. For the greatest fear of death is always that it will pass us by and leave us there alone. And time is a curious thing. Most of us only live for the time that lies right ahead of us. A few days, weeks, years. One of the most painful moments in a person's life probably comes with the insight that an age has been reached where there is more to look back on than ahead on. And when time no longer lies ahead of one, other things have to be lived for. Memories, perhaps. Afternoons in the sun with someone's hand clutched in one's own. The fragrance of flower beds in fresh bloom. Sundays in a cafe. Grandchildren, perhaps. One finds a way of living for the sake of someone else's future. And it wasn't as if Ove also died when his wife left him. He just stopped living. Grief is a strange thing. Thanks for watching.